Our next lecture will be on the modern missionary movement. This lecture is going to be more on the intellectual and philosophical developments and changes in the modern world leading up to the 20th century. I really debated whether or not we should talk about the modern missionary movement first or this subject first. At the end of it all, I don't really know that it matters all that much. But here, we want to approach this subject here of the idea of Christianity in a more modern world. And basically, we're taking the idea of it being from the year about 1650 to the present. Of course, as with all the dates that we've laid down in sort of blocking off different periods of time, the dates are somewhat approximate. They're not really exact. But what I'm taking this from is basically, if you wanted to get really technical, I'd say 1648, the end of the 30 Years' War, and point more to the time when those fundamental religious war questions were settled in the Western world, in Europe, but sort of even more fundamentally, a lot of people were soured on the idea of religion and faith, not only from the terror of the 30 Years' War, but also just from the return to classicism and the emphasis of humanism coming out of the Renaissance. So basically, we're going to talk about several post-Reformation philosophical challenges to Christianity, beginning with the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment movement was seen primarily, or particularly, in a very clear-cut form in 18th century Germany. Karl Barth described it as a system founded on the presupposition of faith in the omnipotence of human ability. In other words, what the Enlightenment stressed was that man can figure it out. There are no real mysteries in the world. Man can conquer them. Man can conquer nature, man can conquer theology, man can conquer technology. It was a great confidence in human ability. It was defined perhaps best, or at least to begin with, by Immanuel Kant in his book, Religion Within the Bounds of Reason Only. This is what he wrote in the book. He said, the Enlightenment represents man's emergence from a self-inflicted state of minority. He means it in the sense of childhood. So mankind has inflicted upon themselves this idea of childhood. The Enlightenment is an escape from that. He says, a minor is one who is incapable of making use of his understanding without guidance from somebody else. Have the courage to make use of your own understanding is therefore the watchword of the Enlightenment. Again, based on this fundamental trust in human reason, in the human ability to analyze and figure things out, the Enlightenment rejected both supernatural revelation, right? Because no longer is it good enough to just say, well, how come that mountain is up there? You can't just say, well, God made it. No, in the Enlightenment it says, no, by human reason we can figure it out why. We can figure out the geological forces that led to all this, and we can analyze this. No longer do we just have to say, well, God did it, and figure it out that way. No, the Enlightenment rejected both supernatural revelation and man's sinfulness. It did not necessarily reject God, but the idea that there was God who was an all-wise creator who had put into man a natural religion. And this natural religion taught both morality and immorality. And now, from the rise of Christianity all the way through the post-Reformation era, the basic questions remain the same. And I want you to think about that. From the time of the apostles to the time of what some people call modernity. Let's just chart it up at the end of the 30 Years' War, about 1650. From that period of time, and of course I'm being very approximate, but just let's say again, from that period of time, mankind basically asked the same questions. The questions were, how can man be right with God? How can I get to heaven? How can I draw closer to God? Now, there was disagreement about the answers, right? People disagreed on the answers, but there was fundamental agreement regarding the questions. Beginning in the 1700s, basic challenges emerged which changed the very questions people were asking about God and Christianity. You know, in the medieval mind, they were concerned with the question, how can I be right with God? But in the Enlightenment, the shift moved, removing God from the center and putting more man in the center. You see, since the Enlightenment and the rise of modern thinking, people don't ask, how can I be right with God? The more typical question people ask is, how can I be happy? How can I be a better person? How can I find fulfillment in life? Now, it's very interesting to me that when Christians live to ask and to answer these kind of questions, they find themselves in a losing battle. You know, but part of our job as Christian sort of messengers to the world is not only to answer the questions that the world has, but to give to them questions that they weren't thinking about. But many Christians order their own Christian life that way. Many Christians give themselves to be followers of Jesus Christ simply for the reason that they believe He will make me happy. He will fulfill my life. I want to have a happy life, and Jesus is the best way, so therefore I'll do it. Do you see, you're still asking those fundamentally man-centered, Enlightenment, reason-based questions, instead of saying, well, how can I be right with God, and how can I glorify Him? C.S. Lewis said this. He said, I didn't go to religion to make me happy. I always knew that a bottle of wine could do that. If you want a religion to make you feel really comfortable, I certainly don't recommend Christianity. That's what C.S. Lewis says, and it's true. Now, this fundamental shift, this fundamental change from sort of a God-centered philosophy to a man-centered philosophy, this is what's important for us to understand, is it wasn't all bad. So much of modern education and thinking and technological advance and science and all the rest of it is really rooted in this basis of saying, mankind getting a new flush of enthusiasm to say, we can figure it out. We can research these things. We don't have to look at a disease in a person and just say, oh, the devil did it. No, now the scientist says, I want to figure out how it happens. And you know what, as the scientist does, he figures out a cure. But along the way, something can get lost. Something can get lost with the idea is that sometimes there is no better explanation than that the devil did it. And so, actually, we don't want to be those who completely reject the ideas of the Enlightenment, but neither can we completely embrace them. One historian I listened to, he called the Enlightenment the endarklement. Well, you got to admit here, though, that the Enlightenment, just naming it that, is a loaded term. Everybody was in darkness before, and now we bring to the world light. Well, that's certainly a biased way of speaking, isn't it? And in some ways, it did bring light to the world, but in other ways, it only brought darkness. Because in spite of the many contributions that the Enlightenment made to culture, to science, and to industry, it was crass naturalism, essentially denying God and essentially denying His saving revelation. One way to analyze the Enlightenment is to say that it was a way for man to gain the whole world and lose his soul. Well, sort of an outgrowth of Enlightenment thinking was the rising confidence in what we might call science, but not just science, but scientism. You see, when I say scientism, I'm referring to the emerging not only of the scientific method, but the idea that the intelligent person is skeptical about everything, and that the person should believe nothing except what can be proved in a laboratory. That's scientism. I won't believe it unless it can be proved in a laboratory. I am going to be skeptical about everything. At its root, scientism denies God. I mean, look, you can't explain things away with God, and you certainly can't prove God's existence in a laboratory. Now, you can certainly prove Him with philosophy. You can certainly prove Him with theology. And of course, you can also prove him with the appeal to natural revelation and to specific revelation, the Word of God. But you see, this rising confidence in scientism, as I call it, was a real outgrowth of this Enlightenment sort of thinking. Now, this thinking started to be applied to Christianity as well, and it developed into a phenomenon that's known as form criticism. Form criticism is an analysis method of literature that seeks to take a piece, usually of ancient literature, and look for patterns, look for structure within that ancient piece of literature to maybe give some clues as to how the literature came together, who authored it, and all the rest. Well, this idea of form criticism, this literary study, was used by German theologians to advance the idea that the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, came from several different sources that each began as oral traditions. And they were eventually written down and then drawn together by a later editor. This is commonly called the JEDP theory, or the documentary hypothesis. The idea is that J represents the Jehovah source, E represents the Elohim source, D represents the Deuteronic source, and P represents the priestly source. And the idea here was as these people examined the Old Testament, specifically the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, they said, well, look, sometimes they use the word Jehovah to refer to God, and sometimes they use the word Elohim to refer to God. That's probably the work of 2 different authors that was mixed together. And then some things really seem to emphasize priestly customs and traditions and ceremonies. That must come from another source. And then there's another source, the Deuteronomic source, that of course would be responsible for most of the book of Deuteronomy. Now, you get this idea. The idea here is that we can figure out the human formation of the Word of God, and therefore it's just a collection of human legends. It no longer has to be regarded as indeed the Word of God. And so this sort of thing was extremely persuasive to many. It was widely taught. Listen, I'm no expert, but as far as I know, it still is widely taught in many colleges and seminaries, as this is the way that the Pentateuch came together. Actually, there's tremendous scholarly difficulties with this theory that I won't go into at the present time. I obviously don't believe it. I obviously believe that Moses, perhaps drawing on some previous written records, I think the book of Genesis gives us some reason to believe that Moses drew on previously established written records. But drawing on both written records and his own personal eyewitness experience, Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Pentateuch, inspired by God. But you see, this sort of thing really helped people to have the idea that there was a natural explanation for the development of the Bible, and that it was not a supernatural book. Now, another factor in the rise of scientism was the emergence of technology and the evaporating sense of dependence upon God. I mean, listen, as mankind becomes more technologically advanced and more able to influence and to control his environment, he becomes less and less sensitive to his own dependence on God. Now, I'm not saying he becomes less dependent on God, but I'm saying he becomes less and less aware of his dependence upon God. Who is more likely to be a man of prayer? A fisherman in a sailboat or a fisherman in a motorboat? You know, the fisherman in the sailboat, he has to pray that God will send the wind so that he can go out and do the fishing that he needs to do. The fisherman in the motorboat, listen, all he needs to do is, pull the cord and he motors to wherever he wants. Rises in modern technology made man feel less dependent upon God. And you have to say, this is a challenge for many people today. I don't know how many of you know the writer, the Bible commentator William Barclay. William Barclay has a collection of commentaries throughout the New Testament. It's called the Daily Study Bible. And overall, I would regard it as a pretty good set of commentaries. He has especially really wonderful insight into some of the nuances of Greek words